Welcome to Exploration and Analysis, and part two of our look into the 2000 presidential election. This is part of our presidential election series. You can watch the other three videos, including our look into the 1992 presidential race, the 1996 race, and part one of our look at the 2000 race by clicking the links in the description below. And I do want to apologize for those of you who saw part one. There was this annoying flickering that kept happening during the video. I have looked into what caused that. Fortunately, I didn't notice it until after it went live, but I'm hoping that I put some fixes in that will prevent that from happening in this and future videos. So in that part one, we focused on the events of the late 1990s and the Democratic and Republican primaries. Here we will look at the general election and its tumultuous results. But first, I want to look at some of the minor parties that were present during this race. So let's look at the Reform Party. At one point, it looked like the Reform Party could be emerging as the most significant third party in America. It sprang out of Ross Perot's strong 1992 candidacy, where he received 19% of the vote. And while his showing in 1996 was a more modest 8%, that was still significantly larger than any other third party showing in recent American history. It was strong enough to earn the party matching funds in the next presidential election, meaning that whomever the party nominated in 2000 would get some public funding to help finance their campaign. Then in 1998, Reform Party candidate Jesse Ventura won the governorship of Minnesota, earning the party a significant elected office. There'd be other Reform Party candidates in offices around the country, lots of different offices, federal, state, local. And while they would often lose these elections, the fact that they had so many candidates around the country showed that they had enough of a movement to be, at least something of a force. But that being said, the party would not be much of a force moving forward, and their collapse is something of a cautionary tale. For one thing, I think their ideology was kind of vague. Unlike other small parties like the Libertarians and the Greens, and the Libertarians and the Greens had strong core beliefs, but the Reform Party was harder to hang your hat on. It was built around Ross Perot and his ideas, but really what were his ideas and how could that build into something moving forward? So he was liberal on some things, conservative on other things, but generally he was for shaking up the system. And Ventura was similar in certain respects. He was also moderate on ideology. So he was left on some things, right on other things. And he was also for shaking up the system. And both Perot and Ventura were quite charismatic individuals, but there were significant differences between them. For one thing, Perot was a protectionist and Ventura was for free trade. Ventura favored loosening drug laws and Perot did not. But besides their policy differences, there were a clash between these two very big personalities. And perhaps they might have been a force if they could have worked together, but they could not work together. And that wasn't the only problem that the party had. There were a lot of people out there who believed in reform as a general idea, and they jumped into this party, but their ideas were all over the map. And some of these people came from other political movements, other political parties, in fact. And as those folks tried to infiltrate the party and they tried to direct the party and its resources in a new direction, either away from Perot, away from Ventura, and towards whatever that person believed. And I'll elaborate on that a little bit moving forward. We have talked about Pat Buchanan's three runs in the Republican presidential primaries. Over the course of 1999, he had become increasingly disgruntled with the Republicans. He felt like the party had drifted away from its core principles, and he felt like the establishment of the party were backing George W. Bush and making it impossible for anybody else to gain traction. So he quit the Republicans and joined the Reform Party. Another person who joined the Reform Party during this time was somebody named Lenora Fulani, and she had been a member of a smaller New Alliance party and had run for president herself in earlier cycles. So she was on the left, but she was allying herself with Buchanan, who was on the right. And this created an obvious dilemma for Buchanan, whereas he had left the Republican Party and he had said it was over principled differences, but he was now allying himself with people who had even bigger differences in principle than he did. But nevertheless, she helped him, at least for a period, in building his support in the Reform Party. And he also brought in a lot of his supporters from his earlier runs in the Republican race now to the Reform Party to sort of build his candidacy there. But he wouldn't be alone. There'd be another person seeking the Reform Party nomination as well, and his name was John Hagelin. And he had also been part of another smaller party movement, and his smaller party was called the Natural Law Party. It's kind of an interesting party. It adhered to a philosophy that blended scientific studies with Eastern New Age philosophy. Hagelin himself had been a theoretical physicist, but he also was somebody who believed in transcendental meditation. It's a little hard to wrap your head around how this philosophy would affect a presidential administration. But once you get past that sort of more esoteric philosophical stuff, you see that the party was fairly centrist. They were pro-environment, certainly, and they promoted a more holistic healthcare, including preventative healthcare uh, more than people relying on the use of medication. So a lot of these ideas would later be part of the MAHA movement, the Make America Healthy Again movement, and there was an emphasis on organic food and more natural foods generally. I don't recall if he was against dyes, synthetic dyes, but I can imagine that that kind of thing would have been something that the Natural Law Party would have been against. So meanwhile, Jesse Ventura is going to quit the Reform Party over frustrations because of his disagreements with Perot and other members of the party. But a lot of Ventura's supporters are going to end up backing Hagelin. Now, Perot himself is not going to publicly back Hagelin, but many of his supporters are going to do so. But that's not going to be enough because Buchanan's going to bring enough of his supporters in from the outside to give him enough support to win the Reform Party nomination. But the process of doing that is going to create quite some headaches for him. John Hagelin is going to end up suing because of what he feels was an unfair nominating process. So there a lot of court battles occurred over that, and it ended up really not helping Buchanan all that much having the matching funds because what came with it was a lot of headaches because the Reform Party was in such disarray, and this battle with Hagelin was rather intense. So Buchanan's campaign is not going to really take off all that much, and the Reform Party is going to pretty much disintegrate after this election. Another party that existed during this time was called the Constitution Party, and they were a party that was to the right of the Republican Party. Originally, they were called the Taxpayers Party, and they formed out of frustration with the first Bush administration, believing that that administration was too moderate. Many supporters of Pat Buchanan had joined first the Taxpayer Party and later the Constitution Party, and there were conversations back and forth between Buchanan and the leaders of that party about him potentially running under their banner in both 1992 and 1996. He ended up deciding not to do that. But had he decided to do so in 2000, I think they would have welcomed him with open arms as he was pretty well aligned with them ideologically. It seemed as though they were both socially conservative. They were both strict constructionists on the Constitution. They were both kind of dovish on their foreign policy. They were both nationalistic. They were both skeptical of entities like the UN and NATO. And so their ideas were pretty close. They were protectionist, but Buchanan decided instead to run under the Reform Party banner, as I mentioned earlier. But I'm thinking that he might have been better off if he had run under the Constitution Party, because, like I said, he would have been welcomed. He would have had a party behind him that really was behind him and really believed in some of the same stuff that he did, and there wouldn't have been this problem with all of the infighting and all of the headaches and all the desperate political entities with all the egos involved with the Reform Party. I think things would have been a lot smoother for him in the Constitution Party. But he decided to go with the Reform Party. It had more name recognition, more funding behind it. As I said, it had the matching funds. So the Constitution would end up nominating Howard Phillips for president in 2000, and he's pictured here. So the Constitution Party is going to continue on in America, throughout the 21st century. They're going to be like the fifth or sixth largest party, during these various elections, and so they're going to get a certain percentage of the vote here in 2000 and be part of the and have their names on the ballots in most states. The Libertarian Party will end up renominating their 1996 nominee, Harry Brown. The Libertarian Party, of course, is a staunchly anti-government party, and they favored a reduced presence of government, particularly the federal government, and making them fiscally conservative but more socially liberal. The Libertarian Party is also strict constructionist, and Harry Browne was a very articulate speaker who could be persuasive in making his points in support of the Libertarian Party's ideas. And they were a small party, but they were fairly stable. They had their core group of supporters, including their diehard supporters, but they also were often able to get in libertarian curious individuals who kind of were disgruntled with the other two parties and liked some of the Libertarian Party's ideas. So it was often a struggle for the Libertarian Party as they had this diehard faction that sometimes bumped heads with the more moderate faction. And this is going to keep the party from growing into a more major force. But Harry Browne, though, is going to be, going to put forth a respectable effort here in the 2000 race. The Green Party was relatively new at this point in time, and they would nominate Ralph Nader. Unlike in 1996, where Nader was sort of a part-time candidate, he's going to run full-time in 2000. So he was a pretty well-known figure. He had been a consumer advocate. He had written a certain number of books. He had fought the auto industry for better protections for consumers, and he had fought other industries too on behalf of consumers. So he was a fairly well-known and well-respected figure, and he was certainly on the left of the political spectrum. Now, the Green Party was certainly itself to the left of mainstream Democrats, so they were a pretty good fit there. Now, the Green Party had been known as an environmentalist party first and foremost, and that wasn't really Ralph Nader's brand necessarily, although he did support certain environmentalist, policies. But when running against Al Gore, it wouldn't have made sense for them to pick a staunch environmentalist who, put that forth as their central issue because Al Gore was such a staunch environmentalist himself. So Nader might have been a good fit because he had a wide array of different issues that he ran on and was definitely somebody who could be seen as somebody who could go after corporations, go after the wealthy, and and that worked well, I think, for people on the left. I think that there were a fair amount of people on the left that were a little bit disenchanted with the Clinton-Gore administration. Maybe they felt that they had compromised too much, or maybe had too moderate of policies on their various budgets and on issues like welfare reform. Maybe they didn't agree with their trade policies. So Nader is going to have a more protectionist trade policy, and he's going to oppose what Clinton had done with welfare. So he's going to differentiate himself in that way, and present people on the left an option to vote that would be somebody different than Gore. So as I stated in part one of our 2000 election video, the Republicans were coming off a disappointing 1998 midterm election, and they had two straight losses in presidential elections as well. So there were some problems with their branding and their image, and they realized that. And they were trying to figure out a way to deal with some of the criticisms that many voters and their opponents had for them. One problem is that they were seen as mean spirited. So when they talked about work requirements for welfare and cuts to safety net programs, Democrats accused them of wanting these things because they were mean. And figures like Newt Gingrich and some other top Republican leaders had demeanors that maybe reinforced this and made it easy to convince voters that the Republicans, wanted to punish poor people because they were uncompassionate. So the first President Bush, with his country club persona, and Bob Dole with his stoic, rough around the edges demeanor, potentially were seen in this same kind of light. So George W. Bush worked on changing that image, and he came up with a theme of compassionate conservatism. And while he still campaigned as a conservative, he sought to soften some of the rougher edges that the movement had been associated with in the 1990s. So some of this took the form of adopting some different policies. So he favored increasing federal spending in certain areas like education. And in the 1990s, a lot of Republicans favored eliminating the Department of Education, whereas Bush now was talking about increasing education spending at the federal level. So this was a major shift. And, he really didn't talk too much about spending cuts generally. And again, for most of the 1990s, that had been a major theme of the Republicans, was how they were going to cut spending. So Bush really didn't focus too much on spending cuts. He did talk about tax cuts, and by not talking about spending cuts while he was talking about tax cuts, it was reversing the emphasis that the party had had on deficit reduction. So Bush might be called a deficit dove. So he took a fairly dovish policy as well on foreign affairs, and he advocated for what he called a more humble foreign policy. And on immigration, he favored a comprehensive immigration reform that mixed streamlining the immigration process with a pathway for illegal residents to become legal. So he hoped that this more warm and fuzzy pitch could help swing voters that had been turned off by Republicans in recent elections to maybe give him a chance. Al Gore, meanwhile, was noticing a different challenge, and this was the beginning stages of Democrats really losing ground with working class voters. Now, as we noted in the 1992 video, there were these Reagan Democrats who had voted for Republican presidential candidates during the races in the 1980s, but now the threat was that many working class voters would drift to the Republicans and start voting for them down ballot as well. And Democrats had been alienating a lot of gun owners with more stringent gun control measures, and a lot of the environmental laws favored by Democrats were seen by working class voters as having gone too far. Now, Bill Clinton had won his two races for the president. I think, even though this broader trend was going on. And I think there were a couple of reasons for that. One, he was able to offset those losses with some appeals to more affluent voters that prior Democrats had not been able to win over. But also, I think that he had a connection with working class voters. He had kind of humble origins himself. And so people liked his origin story. But he had this kind of down home charm, too, that I think worked very well for him at winning over a lot of voters. But could Gore do the same? Well, Gore didn't have the same working class roots as Clinton did. He also lacked the charm and the ability to connect with people. And I think Gore recognized this and made a concerted effort to appeal to more working class voters with some populist rhetoric. And he went after the corporations and the wealthy with this idea of the people versus the powerful. That was the theme that he had in his campaign. So he would try to get fired up in his speeches and talk about this class struggle in order to, appeal more to working class voters. And, it was definitely something that he needed to do, but in so doing, he came across perhaps as inauthentic because this had not been his brand before, and he seemed very awkward, kind of giving these fiery populist speeches. It had never really been the centerpiece of his brand, so he risked alienating people by doing this, but he felt like it was something that had to be done because he needed the working class in order to win the election. The internet is growing in popularity during this time. It's not necessarily going to be an everyday household item for the majority of Americans, but it's moving in that direction. More and more people are starting to have internet. At least if they don't have it in their homes, they might end up using it occasionally. And if they're not using it occasionally, they're certainly aware of its existence. So at this point, the main way people are going to have internet is through dial-up connections, and that's going to keep it from growing as much as it would in later years because those dial-up connections were rather slow. The security was still rather suspect during this time. So online shopping isn't yet going to be picking up as much as it would later on. As far as political news sites, they're going to be growing during this time. Again, I would still say that the majority of the people are still getting their news from other sources, but it's becoming more and more common that people at least use the internet for part of their news gathering process. So, so certainly it is capturing people's imagination. The internet is, and it's certainly becoming a bigger and bigger part of the economy. And what a lot of people may not realize is that the internet started as a military project, and through by in Al Gore's congressional committee work, he had a front row seat in that early development of the internet as part of that military technology, and he had been a proponent of that development of the internet. And this fact, could have potentially helped him politically if he can say that he was an early proponent, an early advocate of this important technology that was starting to transform the country at this point. But the problem is that while he was trying to talk about this fact, he worded it rather awkwardly, and I think, what we might call a gaffe. He said, during my service in the United States Congress, I took the initiative in creating the internet. And what that sounded like was he was saying that Al Gore, invented the internet. And this is going to turn a lot of people off. It's going to feed into his reputation as being disingenuous, pretentious, and self aggrandizing. So something that could have been a political strength of his ended up being a weakness through poor messaging and poor wording. This was an era when certain stories would go viral and capture American attention obsessively. A few years earlier, the O.J. Simpson arrest and trial would become the prime example of this. And while not quite as potent, the Elian Gonzalez story would captivate America's attention in 2000. Elian and his mother fled Cuba to get away from Castro's regime, and the mother died, but Elian would end up with his extended family members in Florida. And the father, back in Cuba, demanded that Elian be returned home to him. The extended family wanted him to stay with them in Florida, but Clinton's Attorney General, Janet Reno, would eventually side with the father, and agents would storm into the uncle's house and remove Elian from his extended family's house there in Florida. So many people in the country disagreed with Janet Reno over this, especially in the Cuban American community. Historically, the Cubans had been a Republican voting bloc, but Clinton had made some inroads with that community. But after Reno had returned Elian to Cuba, many Cuban Americans soured on the Clinton administration. And while Gore wasn't involved with the decision and tried to stay silent on it, Reno's decision would indirectly affect people's feelings on voting for Al Gore. This was really one of the rare times in American history where there actually was a budget surplus. So rather than there being a debate about how to balance the budget, there was a debate about what to do with the surplus. Bush didn't talk about cutting spending like Republicans had been doing for much of the 90s, as I mentioned earlier, but he actually talked about increasing some spending programs, and he talked about a large tax cut. So his plan would simplify the tax code with less rates overall and reducing the top rate to 33%. He'd also propose a $400 per child tax credit and ending the estate tax. That's the tax people pay when they inherit an estate. Now, Gore favored more modest tax cuts and certainly not cutting the top rate, but he didn't favor as much tax cuts as Bush did because he wanted to use the surplus in what he would call the lockbox. And basically, what this idea was to put aside some of that surplus to shore up the inevitable shortfalls that were expected for Social Security and Medicare. Basically, what everybody knew would happen would be that the baby boom population would age in another decade or two and would need to retire, and they'd start collecting Social Security and Medicare, and there'd be such a large number of them. Also, because the population, people were dying older, there would be more money needed for Medicare and Social Security, with less taxpayers paying into those systems. So the idea was that they needed to put money aside for this inevitable demographic shift that would happen. Gore referred to this program as the lockbox. So there would be a sort of difference here with, I think, Gore definitely coming down with a more fiscally conservative, as far as a more deficit hawk kind of a policy than what Bush was proposing. Who would Bush pick as his running mate? To head up the Vice Presidential Selection Committee, Bush chose his father's longtime confidant, Dick Cheney, former Secretary of Defense and former congressman. Cheney's team is said to have considered governors John Engler of Michigan and Tom Ridge of Pennsylvania, and both of those were from battleground states that Clinton had won, but were thought to be close potential pickups by Republicans in 2000. Both were popular governors, but Ridge had the downside of being for legal abortion, which was something that many in the Republican Party frowned upon. Engler might have been a good choice, but Bush faced criticism for his lack of foreign policy experience and expertise expertise, and Angler didn't help him with that. John McCain was also considered, but he and Bush had at times a contentious relationship in the primary, and McCain was ultimately not chosen. So Bush eventually turned to the person in the selection committee, Cheney, and said, "How about you?" And Bush felt comfortable with Dick Cheney. He thought that Cheney's experience and knowledge could help him, and Cheney wasn't likely to help it with a particular constituency or particular state, but he could ease people's concerns about Bush's inexperience and lack of expertise because Cheney was regarded as something of a policy wonk, somebody who had a lot of experience and a good resume. So Cheney ended up being Bush's running mate. Heading up Al Gore's selection committee for a running mate would be Warren Christopher, former Secretary of State. And I think it was clear at this time that Gore was trying to position himself as the more qualified, the more experienced candidate compared to Bush. So he seemed to want to pick a running mate who reinforced that. And there were a couple of candidates who maybe he considered but did not reinforce that, so they were ultimately not picked. And those included Jeanne Shaheen, who at the time was a governor of New Hampshire. She hadn't been elected to the Senate yet at this point, and Jeanne Shaheen was certainly well liked, and was a popular figure. Had won election in a swing state, but she did not have the national or international experience that maybe Gore was looking for, and neither did John Edwards, who had only been elected to the Senate in 1998. While he certainly did have a lot of charisma, he was very well spoken. He had Clinton-like charm, but ultimately did not reinforce that idea that the Gore ticket would be the more experienced, the more qualified. So picking him might have undermined that effort. Now, Evan Bayh might have been an interesting choice, and he had been elected to the Senate in 1998 and had been governor before that. So he did have a bit of a good resume there, but maybe hadn't been in the Senate long enough to really be the guy that Al Gore was looking for. And the other person that was on the list there is John Kerry, a figure that would later run for president. And Al Gore did not end up picking John Kerry, and he did not pick Bill Bradley either, who had, of course, run in the primaries against him. It was said that they had a rather contentious relationship. But one person that he didn't have a contentious relationship was Joe Lieberman, and Lieberman really had good relations with people in Congress in general, including Bill Bradley, including members of both the Republicans and the Democrats. So Lieberman could be somebody who Gore could use as a bridge to Congress because of those strong connections. He could also be a bridge to the media. Joe Lieberman had very good relations with the media. He was from what's called the Scoop Jackson wing of the Democratic Party, which was named after the former senator from Washington State. And Joe Lieberman was rather hawkish on foreign policy. He was into the military issues, military affairs. So he had expertise in those areas, which was something that could be an asset for a running mate. And he was rather moderate on domestic issues. So when he first ran for the Senate in Connecticut, he had run against a moderate Republican named Lowell Weicker. And I think it's fair to say that maybe he was to the right of Lowell Weicker in that race. So Gore ended up picking Joe Lieberman as, certainly somebody that could reinforce this idea of a qualified, experienced person. And he also was somebody who was not seen as a Clintonite. He had been rather critical of Bill Clinton, had been, outspoken when the affair with Monica Lewinsky first broke. He had been one of the first Democrats to condemn Clinton's behavior. So if Al Gore wanted to distance himself from Clinton and convince voters that his term would not simply be a third Clinton term, a guy like Lieberman could really reinforce that, as he was seen as very much a non-Clintonite Democrat. It was a difficult political calculation on how Gore should handle Bill Clinton. Clinton's approval ratings were quite high, as I discussed in the earlier video, but there was a degree of Clinton fatigue, and that fatigue that voters had was rubbing off on Al Gore, and people saw the potential Gore presidency as a Clinton third term. Some voters liked that idea, but there were a lot that didn't, and even those who maybe generally approved of Bill Clinton still maybe thought that it was time to turn a page. He had had the 8 years, and people maybe were looking for a new direction, and maybe they thought Gore was too tied to Bill Clinton. Certainly, Gore was looking to change people's minds about that, and as I said, his pick of Lieberman might have been an effort to change those minds. And apparently, behind the scenes, Clinton had offered to campaign for Gore and to be a bigger advocate for him and be more public about it. But Gore said no to that idea. He was looking to distance himself from Clinton and really didn't want him to have a big part in his campaign. And a lot of people have argued about whether or not that was the right decision. I don't know. What do you think? Put in the comments below. Should Gore have gotten Clinton to campaign more for him than he did? This was still an era where fundraising mattered, as the internet was still relatively new and only used sparingly and not by everybody. So, being able to run ads, especially ads on TV, that was important. And having a well financed campaign was important generally. And Bush was able to raise more money than Gore, as the business interests generally favored him, as he had a pro business reputation as governor of Texas. So, Gore's people versus the powerful messaging helped him with unions, but not so much with businesses. And so Bush had more funds available to run ads than Gore did. Interest groups like the tobacco industry and the gun lobby were also behind Bush, and they were very squeamish about the idea of a Gore presidency. So all of these factors helped Bush in the fundraising area and helped him be able to run more ads and do more campaigning and more events and more organizing in more states. So let's talk a little bit about some of these polls. And here we have polls from the last 4 weeks before the election, done specifically by Pew Research. When I've looked at polls in the past videos, I focused a lot on Gallup, but here we're going to look at some Pew Research polls. And as you can see here, generally Bush had a slight lead, although it was certainly close. Most were in the margin of error. So you see here the October 4th to 8th poll, which is the first column. Bush has a 1 point lead over Gore, 45% to 44%. And then we have the October 18th to 22nd. It's tied at 45%. And then we see Bush, picking up a bit more of a lead in the October 25th to 29th with a 47 to 43%. And then the November poll has Bush at 46 and Gore at 43. So 3 of the 4 polls show Bush with the lead, and the one that didn't showed a tie. So the polls tended to show Bush slightly ahead, but all very close. And then we look here at polls from more polling firms. These ones are all from the week of the election itself. So we have a Newsweek poll from November 2nd, which show Bush ahead 45 to 43, so a 2 point lead there. Marist College also released a poll that day. This one showed a 5 point lead by Bush, 49 to 44. Fox News had a tie between Bush and Gore, 43 points apiece. And then Washington Post had Bush ahead by 3, 48 to 45. And then NBC Wall Street Journal poll had Bush ahead of Gore, 47 to 44. So we see, generally speaking, throughout all these different polls, both the ones leading up in October and then these polls in November, most of them are showing Bush with the lead. And I think that that's something that a lot of people forget. Okay, when the election was coming up, people were expecting Bush to win the popular vote. Ironically, there was some talk that maybe Bush could win the popular vote, but Gore could win the Electoral College based on what some of the different dynamics were in some of the different states. And people were talking much more about that possibility than they were the other way around. All right, so we looked at the popular vote, which was close, most polls showing Bush with a slight edge. But what about the Electoral College? Now, Clinton had won the Electoral College twice with some cushion. So if Bush was going to win in the 2000 election, he was going to need to carry the states that the Republicans had carried in those 2 elections in the 90s, but also carry a fair number of states that Clinton had won as well. So there were not as many public state polls out at this time as there are now. So the campaigns at times did have their own internal polls, and sometimes these were leaked to the media, but not always. So our ability to predict where different states would go was not as well ironed out as it is in recent elections. So it was hard to say what the close states were going to be. It looked like there were going to be quite a few close states, as there had been in 1992 and 1996 as well. And there were different trends going on in different states. Some seemed to be getting more Republican, some seemed to be getting maybe slightly more Democratic. But Gore being a little bit weaker with those national popular vote polls, the thought was that maybe some states would, break towards Bush. So the question now is, what states are the campaigns going to focus on? And we'll take a little bit of a deeper dive at some of these states and try to determine where the campaigns will go. So Gore, with limited resources, had to write off some states that he might not have thought he had particularly good chance of winning, including some states that Clinton had won in 1996, and in some cases in both 92 and 96. So one of those states was Kentucky, and Clinton had won Kentucky twice in both 92 and 96, although the margin in 96 was just 1%. So if Clinton had won the popular vote by 8 points against Bob Dole, but had only won Kentucky by about 1 point, and if the polls now were, hopefully from Al Gore's perspective, going to be about even in 2000, he's probably not going to have much chance of winning Kentucky. Now, he had been from a neighboring state, and that might have helped him. And there was a governor's race in Kentucky that Democrats had won, but the Republicans had won the two Senate seats there. And Al Gore had also alienated the tobacco industry and the coal industry with his environmentalist views. So those were two industries that were very strong in Kentucky. So it kind of made it hard for him to win there, and he didn't really contest it there. The other state that Clinton had won in 96, but not in 92, was Arizona. And Arizona had been a Republican state going back to the Goldwater era. And Bush Sr., like I said, had carried it in 92, but Clinton had carried it in 96. But Gore, again, figuring that his national numbers were so weak compared to Clinton, and he didn't have the funds to campaign everywhere, so he kind of wrote off Arizona as a state he didn't think he could win. He didn't really campaign there. Two other states that had been carried by Clinton twice were Ohio and Missouri, and these were both kind of Rust Belt states with strong working class populations, but they also had rural areas as well with a fair amount of farming. And both states were both geographically and demographically considered kind of middle America, with kind of like a cross section of different segments of the American population. So in the beginning, these two states were highly prized, and they certainly were big battleground states in those two elections in the 90s. But as this 2000 election wore on, the candidates had to make tough choices about how to spend their limited resources and their time. And Gore did not think that these states were winnable by him. So he ended up reducing his focus on these two states in the last couple of weeks of the election. But they ended up being a lot closer, I think, than people thought. So some have second guessed his decision to pull resources out of Ohio and Missouri. Now, some states that were not pulled out of but were highly contested throughout the entire process include three of the states that have continued to be battleground states in recent elections as well. I'm talking about Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And these three rather large states were highly prized, and both candidates thought that they had a shot at winning them. So a lot of resources were spent by both the Gore campaign and the Bush campaign in those three states. Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin had, again, gone with Reagan in those elections in the 80s, but had gone with Clinton in both of the elections in the 90s. Another state that was contested was Iowa. Now, Iowa had gone with Dukakis in 1988, but then had gone with Clinton again in 92 and 96, but it was thought to be a lot closer in 2000 as Republicans had made a lot of inroads there. And then we have the state of Florida, which had gone with Bush Sr. in 1992, but Clinton had managed to carry it in 96. Of course, Florida, a very diverse state with a lot of elderly voters who were alienated by some of the Republican cuts in Medicare. And it also had a strong Hispanic population. Now, Hispanics are diverse, they're not monolithic. So, for example, a lot of Puerto Rican Americans were staunch Democrat supporters, but Cuban Americans were often Republican supporters. And with the Elian Gonzalez matter at hand, maybe it would the Cuban Americans might even vote Republican in stronger numbers this year. Then there were some states that were not on people's radars in the beginning, but Bush ended up making a late push for these states late in the campaign, much to a lot of people's surprise. He had the advantage in fundraising and in resources, and he could afford to campaign in more states. And his internal polls were showing him stronger in places where nobody expected it, and including Al Gore's home state of Tennessee. Nobody really expected Gore to lose Tennessee early on, as it seemed as candidates rarely lost their home states in those days. But again, Bush's internal numbers showed that he had a shot, and he started to spend money there. And you might say that Tennessee, like Kentucky, had a strong coal industry, it had a strong tobacco industry, and Gore had alienated both of those industries, and anybody who might have worked in those industries might have been inclined not to support him. I think there also might have been some folks in Tennessee that maybe thought that Gore had maybe gone Hollywood, or had, gotten to aloof and out of touch with where he came from. So there was a little bit of that. There was also a strong amount of an evangelical presence in Tennessee, and Bush really appealed to evangelical voters. And I think that another state that had a lot of evangelical voters and a strong coal industry was West Virginia. Now, West Virginia had swung hard. Bill Clinton had carried it rather comfortably in the two elections, and Michael Dukakis had carried it as well. In fact, the Democrats tended to win. Jimmy Carter had won in West Virginia, so it had been a Democratic stronghold. It had two Democratic senators at this time, and yet Bush's internal numbers showed that he had a shot, and I think for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. So he, made a push for it, and it kind of, wasn't expected to be a swing state, but the later polls showed that it could be after all. Another state like that is Arkansas, and that had been Bill Clinton's home state, and obviously Clinton had carried it rather strongly in the two elections that he ran, and Democrats tended to do well there generally, but Bush made a play for it. He spent some resources there. His internal polls showed that he had a shot. Again, a lot of evangelical voters there. So Arkansas would become a battleground state, and so would Oregon. And I'm not really sure why Oregon was so close in 2000. Again, this was another state that Dukakis had won in 88. Clinton had won it twice in 92 and 96. And yet here in 2000, the numbers are showing a close race between Bush and Gore. Bush ends up spending a lot of money there late, campaigning there, making a play for it. And then Minnesota was another state in that category. Again, Dukakis had carried it in 88. Clinton had carried it twice in 92 and 96. It had been the home of the likes of Hubert Humphrey and other, Democrats like Paul Wellstone, a liberal progressive, stalwart, and yet the polls were showing Minnesota very close this year. So election day is going to come, and it is indeed going to be very close. With the Electoral College, Bush is going to get 271 electoral votes. 270 is what's needed to win, so he barely makes it over the top. Gore is going to end up getting technically 266 electoral votes, although 267 earned. One elector ended up abstaining. In the popular vote, that's going to be very close as well, but we're going to see Al Gore win the popular vote with 48.4% to Bush's 47.9% of the vote. So a half a percentage difference, with Ralph Nader getting 2.7% of the vote. And this will be the first time since 1884 when Benjamin Harrison won the Electoral College but did not win the popular vote against Grover Cleveland. So that had not happened since then. And the conventional wisdom was that it wouldn't likely happen, that it would take extenuating circumstances for it to happen. Well, it did indeed happen. And it probably happened because Gore's margins in some bigger states like California and New York were maybe strong enough to give him that popular vote cushion, whereas maybe Bush had won some narrower wins over some enough smaller states to kind of add up. Now, as you can see by looking at the map, and in our prior videos we had looked at 92 and 96, which were much more checkered. We're seeing a more geographically homogeneous map this year than we had in those prior two elections. We see the South going solidly Republican. We see the prairie states going solidly Republican. And we do see the Mountain West going solidly Republican. The one sort of outlier there is New Mexico, that one blue state in the kind of southwest area. But other than that, the western states, except for the West Coast, are Republican. Now, the West Coast is Democrat up and down. And we see the Northeast being Democrat, with the one outlier being New Hampshire. And then we see the sort of Great Lakes area going Democratic as well. So, the way the states break down, the map looks a lot less checkered than it did in 92 and 96, and a lot more uniform than it had. So I thought I would take a closer look at some specific states and some of the different margins there. I mentioned Arkansas being Bill Clinton's home state, and in 1996 he had carried Arkansas by 17 points. So now we see Bush carrying it against Gore by 5 points, as it goes 51% to 46%. So that is a swing of 22 points from the Democratic column to the Republicans. A big swing there in Arkansas. Louisiana also had a big swing. We see Bush carrying it with 52.5% to Gore's 45%. So it's a 7.5% margin here with Bush's win. But it had been a state that Bill Clinton had carried by 13 points in 1996. So again, it's a good 20-point swing from what it had been in the 1996 race. And we see Maine on here. I didn't mention Maine earlier, but it was somewhat close. Gore did win it by 5 points, 49% to 44%. Ralph Nader had a stronger than average showing there with 6%. But Maine had been a state that Clinton had carried by 21 points in 1996. So again, that had tightened quite a bit. So we see Gore did end up pulling off a win in Michigan, and that Rust Belt state ended up going for him, and perhaps his messaging with his people versus the powerful might have sunk in there, and he outperformed expectations there. Actually, people were talking about Michigan being a close race. Some were predicting Bush would win it, but here we have Al Gore winning it by 5 points. We see Minnesota, though, very close, 48 to 45.5, so a 2.5% spread in Minnesota. So Gore does carry it, but only narrowly. It was kind of a fight to the finish there. And Ralph Nader, again, does somewhat stronger there with 5% of the vote in Minnesota. Now we see Nevada carried by Bush here, 49.5% to 46%. So a 2.5-point win by Bush in Nevada, a narrow win there. Now New Hampshire is also going to be very close, a state that Clinton had carried, but Bush is going to carry it here, but only by 1 point, as it goes 48 to 47. Iowa is going to be an extremely close state as well, with only 0.3% separating them. So we're going to see Al Gore narrowly win 48.5% to 48.2%. New Mexico is similarly going to be close with a 0.1% difference. So we're going to see Al Gore carry at 47.9 to Bush's 47.8. So we see a lot of very close races here, and And then Ohio, maybe not quite as close, but again, this was a state that Gore had written off in the last couple of weeks and had not really campaigned or spent money there. But we see it relatively close after all. And again, maybe that people versus the powerful messaging had, won over some voters in Ohio, as it ended up being closer than what people thought. So Bush did win it with 50% to Gore's 46.5%. And Missouri was also closer than people thought, 50.5 to 47%. Again, a 3.5 point spread there in Missouri. Now, Pennsylvania, again, Gore is going to win Pennsylvania, another Rust Belt state like Michigan, that he's going to carry by about 4%. Again, maybe that people versus the powerful messaging had him do well there. Even though it was a coal state, he still managed to win it by about 4 points. We're going to see Oregon being very close. Again, a half of a percent difference there between Al Gore at 47% narrowly winning against Bush's 6.6% of the vote, with Ralph Nader getting 5% there, respectable turnout by him in Oregon. And then we're going to see Al Gore's home state of Tennessee going with Bush. Much of an upset to a lot of people. We'd see 51% by Bush to Al Gore's 47%. He loses his home state. And then West Virginia, we're going to see a big swing there. This was a state that Clinton had carried by 15 points, but now we're going to see a 22-point swing, and Bush is going to carry it by 7 points, or I guess 6.5 points. So, yes, it's going to be won by Bush, and not really all that close, not as close as some of these other states, even though it had been a state that Michael Dukakis had won and Clinton had won it rather comfortably. Senate candidates like Robert Byrd and Jay Rockefeller had won there, but Al Gore was not able to win. And then finally, Wisconsin, another very close state, and we see Al Gore narrowly winning with 47.8% to Bush's 47.6%. So again, we see a lot of states with less than 1% and a few of them with less than 0.5% difference. So a lot of close states there. And I think that covers all the close states. I don't think there were any others. So maybe that about wraps it up. Oh, wait. My producer is telling me that there was one more close state that I didn't talk about. So let me talk about that in the next slide. Of course, that other close state is going to be Florida, and both candidates are going to get around 48.8% of the vote. So basically, in the first count, there was about 1,000 votes that separated Bush from Gore. And the way Florida state law works is that when it's less than half of a percent separating the candidates, there's going to be an automatic recount, and that recount is going to be done by machines. And when they did the recount, the vote narrowed even further. There was like a 327 vote difference when they did the second count. So Florida law also allowed a candidate to request a hand recount in certain counties if it was close and if they so chose. So Al Gore is going to trigger this hand recount, and he's going to request that there be a hand recount in 4 different counties, Democratic counties. They wanted to recount those, and there was some concern that these machines that were being used to count the votes wasn't picking up everybody's vote, and they wanted to do it by hand and try to ascertain, if the machines weren't picking it up, what was the intent of the voter, who did the voter intend to vote for, and this would cause quite a controversy. It wasn't as straightforward as you might think because of the way these machines read the information that got fed into them and the way that the voters showed who they wanted to vote for using these cards that they were given. While not every county in Florida used the same method of voting, a lot of them use these punch card system that I want to talk a little bit about. So picture a hole puncher, maybe you used one of those in school or elsewhere, where you're punching a hole in a piece of paper. So the way these worked is you would get a card, and each card would have a candidate's name on it, and then a little thing that you would punch in with a hole puncher to mark your vote. So if you wanted to vote for Al Gore, there would be a little thing that you would punch, and you would punch the spot in the card that indicated you were voting for Al Gore. So to wrap your head around that, picture when you used to take tests in school, often standardized tests or any kind of test where there would be a computer that was scoring it. So what would happen is you would get very specific directions that you needed to mark your answer using those little bubble things. You'd mark the bubble with your pencil, and you would be told make sure it's dark enough and make sure the thing is fully the bubble is fully filled out, and or else it won't count. Furthermore, if there's any stray marks that go into other bubbles, it won't count for that reason either. So picture those bubbles not filled out enough as an undervote, and picture the pencil kind of straying into other areas as an overvote. Now, what we're going to see is both undervotes and overvotes with these cards here, because what's going to happen is a lot of times these cards are not going to be punched through all the way, and there'll be little bits of the paper kind of hanging off, and we're going to call these things chads, and we're going to call them undervotes if the machines don't read it because these little bits of paper still remain. So those are the undervotes. Now the overvotes are when there's both a mark in the hole is punched, but there's also something written in, and that's equivalent to giving two answers. So the machines are going to discount those two, but they're going to discount them as a kind of overvote, whereas the ones that are not punched through all the way are going to be discounted because of an undervote. So I want to focus on those undervotes because that's what everybody was focused on, and we'll look at these kind of different kinds of chads. So the chads were different standards that were used to mark what would happen with these holes that were supposed to be punched in all the way that the machines weren't reading. And the sort of lowest standard was the pregnant chad. So this would be if somebody were to punch these holes, but all that kind of happens is a little indentation, like somebody who's pregnant, their belly kind of protrudes. So if you see the little hole start to protrude a little bit, but it's not really punched through, that would be a pregnant chad. A dimpled chad is kind of like that, but maybe there's a little bit of penetration, I guess, in the dimpled chad. But the other ones would be if, like I said, it's partially punched and maybe the little paper is kind of dangling. Those are the dangling chads. And then there's the swinging door chad where it's punched in and then the paper is kind of swinging there. So those are kind of like the different standards. And then the question was, so which of these should count, which of them shouldn't count? According to Al Gore's teams, they should use the broadest standards. They should try to count as many of them as possible, try to determine the will of the voter. Bush's team said that, well, we don't really know the will of the voter. They didn't punch it in all the way. Maybe they didn't really mean to vote that way. And, the law says that the machines are supposed to be the ones counting them. And if they didn't follow the directions correctly, maybe the vote shouldn't count. So there was this back and forth over that. And what the Florida Supreme Court ultimately decided was to let each county make that decision on what standard to use, whether or not to count maybe dangling chads but not pregnant chads, or maybe to count all of them, or maybe to count none of them. Let the counties decide. But that decision would get challenged in court. But interestingly enough, I think the assumption that both sides had was that having this broader standards of counting these undervotes would help Gore, because the thought was that more of these people that weren't punching in the holes all the way were disproportionately going to be Gore supporters. They might be elderly people that maybe weren't strong enough to punch it all the way, or maybe just lukewarm voters who really didn't care all that much, so they couldn't be bothered to kind of punch it all the way. It's thought that more of those voters would have been for Gore than for Bush. So both teams believed that, and that was why Bush wanted those counted, and why Gore wanted those votes counted, and why Bush didn't. So the courts are going to get involved, and what the Florida Supreme Court is going to first do is to have each county do a recount based on the standard deemed proper by that particular county. So Bush's team is going to challenge that they can't have different standards in different counties on what chads they're going to count and what chads they're not going to count. And he's going to argue that the 14th Amendment is going to prohibit that kind of thing because of the Equal Protection Clause. So the Florida Supreme Court is going to suggest, well, why not have one statewide recount with one standard and this can be followed by every county in Florida. The only problem with that is that if the court mandated such a thing and mandated such a standard, the court would be overstepping its role as a judicial branch because that would be legislating, and courts are not supposed to legislate. So if the court were to determine what standard to use and what kind of chads would count and what chads wouldn't count, that would be effectively legislating, and courts can't do that. So the U.S. Supreme Court ended up striking down the Florida court's decision and ending the recount basically, and Bush is going to be declared the winner. It's worth noting that eventually media organizations are going to get hold of all these ballots and perform recounts of their own. So the recounts are going to happen, but they're going to be kind of unofficial recounts after the fact. Now, interestingly enough, when they did these recounts and they used the methods that the Gore team were proposing, Bush still won. So whether they just recounted the counties that Gore wanted recounted, or if they did it statewide, Bush wins, whether they do pregnant chads or dangling chads or dimpled chads, Bush wins. But Bush didn't win every recount on every standard. There also were the overvotes. And I said I would get back to the overvotes later because the overvotes were not focused on in any of these court cases or in any of the discussions during the whole recounting process. Remember, the overvotes are when there's more than one mark made. So you could have a hole punch for a candidate, and then you could have somebody write in Al Gore or George W. Bush or Pat Buchanan. So what ended up happening was when they recounted these, all the people whose votes weren't counted because they wrote something in as well as punching the hole, when they added those up, Gore ended up winning. So it was the opposite of what everybody expected, because what you had was these overvotes were people who were super enthusiastic. They were punching it and writing it. So they were, going overboard with their vote, and that was causing the vote not to be counted. So it wasn't these unenthusiastic people not punching the holes thoroughly enough that were causing Gore to lose. It was actually the people who were overzealous in how they were voting and, causing their votes to be discounted because of that overzealousness. Whereas actually it turns out that the people not punching the holes thoroughly enough ended up being disproportionately Bush voters. So nobody was expecting that beforehand, but that ended up being the case. So a lot of people at the time said that it was the Supreme Court that handed Bush the presidency. It turns out that had the U.S. Supreme Court done exactly what Gore's team wanted, then Bush still would have won, because based on the standard that he was suing for, Bush still won. But if they used this other standard that nobody was talking about at the time, then Gore still might have won at that time. Well, I hate to speculate about what might have been. When the election is so close, it's kind of hard not to. Could Gore have won if certain things had been different? Had his campaign team made some different decisions, maybe a different running mate, maybe focusing on different states, could he have won? I'd be interested to read people's thoughts on that in the comments section, because I think it's an interesting thing to ponder. I don't think his campaign team was necessarily bad. I know another YouTuber did a video recently where he ranked what he thought were the best run campaigns and the worst run campaigns. He thought Gore's was one of the worst ones because I guess Gore had a lot going for him and he lost nonetheless. But remember, Gore's poll numbers and his expectations beforehand were kind of low. People kind of thought he was going to lose. The polls were certainly showing that, and he outperformed his polls. He outperformed his expectations, and that usually means the campaign team is pretty good, because a campaign team is all about winning over soft voters and winning over swing voters and the get out to the vote drives that they do in the last minutes of the campaign. So if he was rather successful in that, it must mean he had a pretty competent campaign team. But nonetheless, perhaps there might have been some different decisions that could have allowed him to win, and I'd be interested to read people's thoughts. As to Bush, I had said it in the part one of the video, I had a hard time seeing what his strengths were when he ran, and I'd be interested to hear people's thoughts on that, because, he must have had some strengths. He had won the primaries rather convincingly, and he won 2 general elections. So obviously he was connected connecting with people. He had a certain appeal to them. And, I just, didn't necessarily see those strengths as he ran, but I'd be interested to see what other people thought about that and what maybe I was missing or what wasn't connecting with me. As for Nader, I think that there are certainly those who blame Nader. They might use the term spoiler, but I don't like to use that because I kind of feel like, voters have a choice, and if a candidate is going to give them the choice, nobody's pointing a gun to their head. So while both Nader and Gore might have been on the left side of the spectrum, Nader wasn't taking votes away from Gore. They weren't anybody's votes to be taken. Those voters could have voted for Gore if they wanted to, but Nader gave them a choice and they made that choice. So I don't really like to use the term spoiler alert, but I do think moving forward after this, I think third party candidates and independent candidates are going to struggle to get larger percentages of votes because of this stigma of being called a spoiler that I think Nader had kind of reinforced. So as far as Bush's presidency goes, I think he's going to struggle with a lot of people questioning his legitimacy. The idea of questioning the legitimacy of an election is certainly nothing new, and it was certainly that something that many Democrats were doing at the time. And if you go back to the congressional vote on whether or not to certify those electors, there were many Democrats speaking out against doing so and voting against doing so. Not the majority, but there certainly were a large contingency of Democrats that were indeed questioning the certification of those electors. And, after Bush starts assuming the presidency, he's going to struggle to be seen as having a mandate. Remember, this would be the first time since 1888 that a candidate would win the presidency without winning the popular vote. That other time had been when Benjamin Harrison won the electoral vote, but Grover Cleveland had won the popular vote in 1888, and we'd see Cleveland come back 4 years later and win the presidency. So I think that this hurt Bush's mandate. Also, in the Congress, we're going to see Democrats picking up more seats in the House. Republicans are still going to have a narrow control. And in the Senate, it's going to be a 50-50 tie. And Dick Cheney will be there to break that tie as the vice president. Now, interestingly enough, had Al Gore won, the Republicans still would have controlled the Senate because Joe Lieberman would have had to have given up his Senate seat to become vice president. And there likely would have been an interim senator from Connecticut that would have been a Republican because the governor would have picked that interim senator, and he was a Republican. So kind of an interesting footnote. But the Republicans would still have a narrow control of both houses of Congress for the time being as Bush starts his presidency. So he is going to be able to get a lot of his legislation passed, including a tax proposal that's going to be pretty close to what he proposed in his campaign. But one thing he is going to change is that humble foreign policy that he's going to campaign on. He's going to change his views on that, but maybe that's a topic for another day. I'm going to conclude here now, but certainly I'd like to hear people's comments, so be sure to share your thoughts. And if you want to share this video, please do so. Perhaps like the video, but otherwise, hope to see you again in future videos.